Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're going to give a moment or two for everybody to filter in, and there's still some people joining, but on behalf of the Journal of Science Policy and Governance and the UK Science and Innovation Network and Arizona State University, we're really, really glad that you're here with us, and thank you for making the time. All right. Well, I think since our time is somewhat limited here, we're gonna get started. My name is Joey Eschrick, and I work at Arizona State University's Center for Science and the Imagination. And we are delighted to be co-hosting this event with the Journal of Science Policy and Governance and the UK Science and Innovation Network. And so we're all really excited to be presenting this event. And our goal today is to have some conversations and do a bit of an interactive workshop-y activity to reimagine positive climate futures with a kind of policy focus through developing creative narratives. And before we talk more about narratives and I set the stage a little more for what we're actually going to be spending our time doing today, I wanted to provide some brief background on the Journal of Science Policy and Governance for those who may not be familiar. So let me start by putting the journal's website in chat here. And so the Journal of Science Policy and Governance is an internationally recognized open access peer-reviewed publication that covers a variety of areas in science and technology policy. And the journal bolsters research and writing credentials for early career scholars in science policy and encourages them to engage in policy discourse and debate. And to that end, the journal publishes op-eds, technology assessments, policy memos and analyses, white papers, book reviews, workshop proceedings, and other research articles. So a whole plethora of content. The journal also promotes these publications through global mailing lists and events like workshops like this, webinars, and a podcast where folks from the journal interview published authors. You can follow JSPG on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And actually, let me put those links in the chat as well. And that's all of the different social spots. There's a YouTube channel where recordings of events are posted, and the non-small group working portions of today's event will be posted there on YouTube as well. So if you want to follow the journal, here's all the accounts, and as well as a link to a newsletter where you can keep up to date with future events and publications. So many folks who are here today may know that JSPG partnered with the UK Science and Innovation Network on a special issue recently on climate change solutions leading up to the UN Climate Change Conference, COP26, which takes place in Glasgow, Scotland this November. And today we have authors from the issue here, and you'll be hearing from them and having a chance to work with them a bit later. And then here, let me share the special issue link in the chat. So I urge you to check that out and read the articles by the folks who are represented here at this workshop, but also the other authors who couldn't be here with us today. So this is not run as a webinar. We're running this as like a big Zoom session. So please mute your microphone if you're not speaking. We will, the facilitators can to various extents mute you if there's background noise that we're hearing, but it'll make our lives much easier if you just default to muting, and we appreciate that. And in terms of what to expect for the next 90 minutes, I will share a schedule in the chat. So this is a bit of a kind of run of show or agenda to give you a sense of what to expect. So we'll have some opening remarks, followed by a panel with Climate Imagination Fellows from Arizona State University, 3 of which are here with us today, and then breakout rooms to do some collaborative story generation around some science policy ideas and themes led by the fellows and by authors from the special issue. And then we'll come back and recap together and have a little bit of time for discussion. So feel free to ask any questions in the chat for our speakers. And we have really short bite-sized periods for Q&A after each thing. So you can either send them directly to me at the Journal of Science Policy and Governance handle in chat, or you can just post them in chat. And now I would like to provide a brief introduction of Emily Cloke, who is British Consul General in Los Angeles. Emily, thank you so much for being with us here today. And she is the senior representative of the UK government in Southern California, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, and Hawaii. Emily has a range of policy, commercial, and international experience working for the British government, and her recent roles include Deputy CEO for the UK Africa Investment Summit hosted by the Prime Minister in 2020, and she was also a senior leader in the Department for International Trade Sectors Group, overseeing export and investment promotion for industry sectors that include aerospace, advanced manufacturing, and education. And Emily started her career as a lawyer in the City of London and studied law at Cambridge University. And you can find out more about her here and just put her bio in the chat. So Emily, thank you so much for joining us today. And we look forward to some brief remarks to help set the table for the activities and conversations we'll be having.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for that introduction. And hi, everyone. I'm so delighted to be here with you today for what I think will be a really fascinating and positive workshop. So this, as has already been set out, follows a special climate edition of the Journal of Science Policy and Governance, where a challenge was set out to early career researchers. And it ended with some really amazing, inspiring articles, reimagining the future on climate, positive visions of the future. I personally believe that storytelling has a really incredible power. It has the power to make real the pressing challenges of our time, to capture people's imagination, and also to inspire and to affect our heart. And it's often an article or a film or a story that makes real challenges people are facing, or that really sort of helps make things real. So that's why I think workshops like today are so incredibly valuable. Climate change is the pressing challenge of our time. It is affecting every region in the world, and we need global transformation to reduce emissions and to limit global warming so it doesn't go beyond 1.5 degrees. And that is why it is the UK government's top foreign policy priority. We at the UK consulate based in Los Angeles are focusing on this as a priority, as are our other consulates, embassies around the world, and our governmental policymakers back in the UK too. In November of this year, we're hosting with Italy COP26, the UN Climate Change Conference in November in Glasgow. And that will bring together global leaders, policymakers, civil society, a range of organizations to come and make commitments on how we can do that, how we can reduce emissions and protect the planet. We need diverse voices to tell that story. It's got to be an all of society approach. It can't be top down. And again, that's why the collaboration between scientists and with the general public is so valuable. Science has got to be at the heart of all of what we do. So thank you so much for having me here. And I'm happy to say a little bit more about COP26 as well and what the UK government is working on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emily. So as I said, we have a few minutes for questions before Emily needs to leave us. And I do have a couple questions, Emily, but I would love to hear from folks in the session too. So if anybody has a question, it looks like we do have one from Andrew, so I'll read it out. Andrew, thank you so much. So can governments such as the UK use imagination-led processes to resolve the inherent contradictions and dilemmas in addressing climate change? And he refers specifically to the existence of a net zero pledge, while new openings for oil exploration and extraction are happening, not just in the UK, but worldwide. So how do, at a policy level and at international relations level, how do you address some of those challenges and contradictions, Emily?
So really great question. And I think a lot of people here today will probably help answer that question, because ultimately I think, government has some of the answers, but we don't have all the answers. So we rely on people across the population, across the general public and experts to help us do that. The UK government has put climate as its top foreign policy priority, and we've sought to do that in a number of ways. So we believe that action has got to start at home. So we've started to make our own commitments. For example, back in December, we made commitments around emissions reduction. So committing to reduce emissions by 68% by 2030 compared to 1990 levels. And that has been the highest pledge of any major economy to date for that specific 2030 target. And the UK has also tried to show that reducing emissions doesn't need to be contradictory to growing our economy. And so again, to throw another statistic out there, between 1990 and 2019, so pre-pandemic, the UK reduced greenhouse gas emissions by 44% while growing our economy by 78%. And we've also set out a 10-point plan on how we can try and harness a green industrial revolution that covers areas like offshore wind, but it also makes quite a major commitment around ending the sale of new petrol and diesel cars in the UK by 2030. So we're trying to make a number of commitments across the economy, across a number of different areas. Obviously, there'll be contradictions in there, I'm sure, but I think that's where we can rely on others outside government to do that with us and to work with us. And given that the expertise around using imagination and trying to solve some of those contradictions, I'm really excited by what you all have to say about that as well. I don't profess to having all the answers by any means.
So since there isn't another question in the chat, I just wanted to ask Emily while we have a moment or two, what sort of actions and plans has the Los Angeles consulate been doing running up to COP26, and what are your plans for the next couple of months running up to the conference?
Thank you. So the UK consulate, you mentioned at the beginning, we represent the UK in Southern California, Arizona, Hawaii, Utah and Nevada. And we have teams across a number of different interests. So we have a trade investment team, science and innovation, climate, British Film Commission, Visit Britain, a number of different areas. And I say that to highlight that our interests are quite diverse. But in the same way that tackling climate change is an all of society approach, we try and make that an all of consulate approach. That's about embedding climate change objectives across all of our teams. So for example, when our trade and investment colleagues speak to companies, we're highlighting what we're doing on COP26. We're highlighting the UK's commitment, how we're working internationally on it, speaking to companies about signing up to the various pledges and initiatives we want all our companies to sign up to. When we're, for example, our British Film Commission is looking at greening production. So we're looking to work across all of our interests to make sure that we can really multiply action. Another thing that our consulate is really focused on here, because of where we're sitting, our expertise is on UK policy and objectives, but we're sitting in the region, and what we can do here is look at where there's benefit to forming partnerships. So for example, where the UK has got expertise on, let's say, offshore wind, and where certain states are wanting to do more on that, how we share that expertise, and vice versa. So where we can collaborate and come together and share expertise to increase the impact, that's very much at the core of what we do. And an example of that in Los Angeles would be around zero emission vehicles. So over the last few years, and colleagues that have dialed in from the Science and Innovation Network have been at the core of that. So how do we share policy expertise, commercial expertise to make sure that we're decreasing our emissions, but also growing our economy together? So we continue to press forward on that and spot opportunities across our different states. And part of that is also around building relationships and stakeholder relationships. So we work with cities, with mayors, governors, universities, to share that expertise, but also do public diplomacy together, so engagement with the public. And we've done a number of really interesting events over the last few months. For example, I participated in youth summits in California most recently around what we can do on climate change and sustainability. On the science and innovation side, we did a fantastic event a few months ago in San Diego with the Scripps Institute and the California State Senate leader This week, I'm doing events in Utah on renewable energy. So across the patch, we're continuing to try and illustrate just how important it is to take action, but also listen. Because like I said, government don't have all the answers. We need to work across all of society to do this.
Emily, thank you so much. I know that your time with us is pretty severely limited, but we appreciate you setting the stage for what we're going to be doing here and taking some time to answer some questions too. So thank you so much.
My pleasure. Well, I'm really excited to see what will come out of the climate imagination. So thank you for facilitating this event and for everyone for joining. I think all these brilliant minds will come up with some great work.
Wonderful. And I should say before Emily goes that a couple members of her team are here. So things that happen at this workshop will definitely percolate back to her as well. So
and they've done a great job. So thank you to them too.
Yes. Thanks so much.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. All right. And I'm also delighted to welcome back Adriana Bankston from the Journal of Science Policy and Governance, the CEO of the journal, who is now joining us and is gonna help me run things and give me a much needed assist, actually. So thank you all so much for bearing with me while I've been doing this. But what we're gonna do next is shift to a conversation with our Climate Imagination Fellows. Again, my name is Joey Eshrick. I'm gonna from the Center for Science and the Imagination at Arizona State University, and just to introduce what we're doing next, I'm part of running this Climate Imagination Fellowship program, which I'll talk more about in a moment. But we are lucky to have 3 of our Climate Imagination Fellows here. And I will tell you more about them and about the fellowship now directly. So the Climate Imagination Fellowship was kind of inspired by this idea that when we think about climate futures, it's very easy to summon up narratives of catastrophe and of system collapse. So not just disasters like hurricanes and floods, wildfires and heat waves that we've become so sadly accustomed to this summer, but also failures in policymaking, public service, and disaster response that kind of supercharge the effects of those natural disasters. But these stories of alarm, of disaster, don't speak to everyone. And for many, we've learned from our social scientist colleagues, they lead to shutdown. They lead to reactions of denial and avoidance, a sense of hopelessness, a total loss of agency for our ability to affect the future individually and collectively. So alongside stories of warning and alarm, we need to be on the lookout for positive stories that can help broaden the movement for climate action, to give us visions of the future to work towards, and a path to sort of trace, to pathfind, to trace pathways for local action, as well as regional collaboration and global coordination, to imagine new ways to live and thrive on this planet outside of the models, outside of the stories that we have right now. And so that's the thinking behind this Climate Imagination Fellowship, which is sort of the reason that we're gathered here today, the catalyst for it anyway. And that's a program that brings top science fiction authors from around the world together with researchers, advocates, policymakers, and community members to create visions of these positive climate futures that are grounded in real science, as well as grounded in the realities of specific local communities and their complexities. So, and this fellowship program is a partnership of our center at ASU, where I work, as well as the Climate Works Foundation, the UN High-Level Climate Champions, and TED Countdown. And our fellows are in the process of consulting with climate experts and advocates and crafting stories about the future, and participating in a bunch of different events and workshops like this one, leading up both to the TED Countdown Summit, a major gathering in October focused on decarbonization, as well as the UN Climate Change Conference, COP26, in November in Scotland. And our fellows' stories, along with essays and other materials coming out of this project, will be published in a Climate Action Almanac next year in 2022. So today I'm delighted to introduce 3 of our fellows with whom I'll have a brief discussion here before we do our kind of interactive main stage activity. And so first we have Libia Brenda, a writer, editor, and translator based in Mexico City, and one of the co-founders of Cúmulo de Tesla, a collective that promotes dialogue between the arts and the sciences. Hannah Onoguwe, a writer of fiction and nonfiction based in Yenagoa, Nigeria, an award-winning poet and author of the short story collection Cupid's Catapult, as well as Vandana Singh, a speculative fiction author, professor of physics at Framingham State University, and interdisciplinary researcher on the climate crisis. Vandana was born and raised in New Delhi, India, and is now based near Boston, Massachusetts. So thank you all three for being here today and having this conversation with me. And I think what I'm going to try to do really quickly while we're talking is pin all of your
you should all
videos.
be pinned now. You're all good.
Oh, good. Thank you, Adriana. Okay. Let's see. Okay. So, all right. So we just have time for, just like with Emily, just a couple of quick questions and topics to discuss, but I wanted to go around the table, kind of, so to speak, and ask you all, when you're approaching a climate fiction story for this project or any other, or even any piece of fiction that is grounded in science and technology in the real world, how do you approach the research and fact finding for that story? How do you build a world that will resonate with actual challenges and complexities while still crafting a compelling piece of fiction? Vandana, can I pick on you to go first on that? I've worked on with Vandana on a few of her research processes, so.
Well, thank you, Joey, and thank you, everybody, and it's wonderful to be here. I apologize in advance because I have to run away early, so I'm going to try to keep my answers short. Always a challenge for somebody who's a professor. Try to do my best. So in terms of approaching a story that's based on science, technology, and the real world, well, firstly, I approach the research with the same diligence that is due a kind of mini PhD thesis, which means that I read a lot of papers, academic research papers, I read news articles, I read books, but I also talk to a lot of people. And that's one of the things that, Center for Science and Imagination has made a lot easier for us, connecting us with experts on almost anything under the sun. And at the same time, I like to talk to members of communities who are, who I might be writing about, like communities at the forefront of climatic impacts. So a lot of that research is really, really key. And making it, and yet keeping the logic of the story and making it powerful as a story means that it must speak not just to the intellect, but to the heart and the mind and the soul. And so, and you have to build in the complexity of the real world. And actually stories are a brilliant way to do that, because you can choose, like, in mainstream Anglophone literary fiction, often there's a lot of navel gazing and there's psychological complexity focused on one person. But the kind of fiction that we speculative fiction writers write is one that engages the human and the non-human world. And so the way that we approach it, or at least speaking for myself, it's like often, one scenario, one character in a certain scenario, and place becomes really important. Like for instance, I have a story in which there's a woman running through a forest at the edge of an experimental city. And she's trying to solve a problem with one of the solar towers. But at the same time, she's dealing with, her grandmother's sickness and the immediacy of loss. And as I have her run through into the city, you see that it's a city that is completely different from our current, the way we think about cities in general, because I build in technological complexity, both high tech and low tech, sociological complexity, ecological complexity, all of those come through in the story. And it's still a relatively short story. So that's just one example.
Yeah. So Libia, Hannah, how do you approach research, whether it's parallel and similar to things that Vandana does, or is there anything you really focus on when you're trying to get your head around a new story, especially one that has to account for all of this like new external information?
Well, in my case, hi, hello, hi, everybody, and thank you for having me and for this wonderful space. In my case, I think I try to build the things that are mostly for research parallel to the story. Like, what do I want to tell? What story do I want to tell? And That is like the first point, and from that I advance, and then as I want to tell a story, a lot of questions rise. So I am going to be researching very specific things, and many times it's like I read 5 articles just in order to put one little line or one little phrase about, like, I don't know, she was eating this or that, and it's like I have to research if those foods are growing in the environment or stuff like that. So I think it's going like a ladder, you know, like in one side you have the story and what you want to tell, and it is, if it is compelling, if it has verisimilitude. And on the other hand, in order to build that verisimilitude, I have to do like a lot of questions, and also, as Vandana said, to talk about the central themes with a lot of people that is an expert. In my case, I have the fortune to have this Cúmulo de Tesla. It's a collective in which we are participating scientists and writers and artists. So I have a shorthand working with people that also has these same interests. So for me, it's a fortune. Also, the CSI did it for us. But I don't sacrifice like the story like for showing science or for showing the research. The research has to be in second place, if that makes sense, because the story has to be good. The story is not also human, but it has to be a good story. That I try to be honest in what I want to tell. And I also believe that from the particular, you can reflect the general. So you can do a very detailed story of one person, and that can reflect what is happening in the world without being too preachy about, oh, we are doing this or that to save the planet, or, you know, yeah, that would be my short answer.
Hannah, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Just to add to what they've said about not being preachy. I try not, I think I have a tendency to be preachy, so I look out for that when I'm writing. So especially you're writing, you know, for people from these parts, you want to like tell them, no, you have to stop, you know, you have to be serious with these oil companies, you can't let them get away with things. But for the research, I think I do, like Vandana said, you read more than you put in, usually. And with the people and experts provided, you have to like, just for me, it's putting my mind in that space where, even though it's new to me, even though the subject is new to me, it kind of becomes familiar, so that when I think about it, it flows. You know, I'm not a pure science person, so when I want to think of a particular theme, once I'm writing about it, I don't want to be lost in my head. So I read further than what I use. And then I also try to, like Libia said, I want to make it more about the character. Like usually the books I like to read, I don't want the information to swamp what is really going on with the person or people in the story. So I try and put it alongside, but so I think I usually start with the character first and then build in all those technicalities as I go. And hopefully you care more about the character and you don't drop, she doesn't or he doesn't get lost in all the facts and figures and the terms that are, you know, have been researched. That is what I usually try to do, so that you care about what happens to them at the end, usually.
Thank you all for those reflections. Yeah, I think that question of what some critics call information economy is really central to science fiction, and it's an incredible balancing act with climate. I think especially when we're writing in this vein, it's like you want to get information to people, but you don't want, like you said, I really like that verb swamped. You don't want to swamp the character with all of that information. So really briefly, before we turn to 1 or 2 quick questions, but I want to see if maybe you can all each give like a 30-second soundbite for this very hard question. You know, I think one of the challenges too with writing fiction with a purpose like this is that you can't know how fiction is going to get, how people are going to react and what they're going to do after they read a piece of fiction, or even what kind of sense they'll make of it. But as you're writing climate fiction in the 2020s, what role do you think fiction might play, or what are you hoping that your story will do? Like, if a reader encounters your story, like what's an outcome that you hope for? A new idea, or a new habit of mind, or a new perspective? Yeah, like if you could each just share really briefly, and Vandana, maybe you could kick off again. What's something that we can hope for that fiction can do?
Well, I think one of the most important things that particularly speculative fiction can do is to kind of immerse us in an alternative reality, because all of us come from, and carry around with us certain frameworks or paradigms, which are filled with unquestioned assumptions, defaults that we don't even know are there. And you can think of this as a generalized kind of paradigm of modern industrial civilization, but we also carry paradigms connected to our work, like for instance, I'm not in the policy world, and that's a different world from my world, which is as a scientist and science educator. So we carry assumptions that we don't even know are there. This is what I call paradigm blindness. It's a trap of the imagination. And related to this is this notion that I call the reality trap, for lack of a better term, where we assume that the current reality, especially the reality as generated by the most powerful, is all there is we have to inform the future. So in a sentence, what speculative fiction can do is to kind of shake us loose from those unquestioned conceptual moorings and the trap of the imagination, so that we can really, really listen to what the problem has to teach us. So.
Thank you for that. Livia, I'm just going to keep going in the same order.
It's okay. Well, I am from the so-called third world, because Mexico is so-called third or fourth world. So I am very interested in people that can read the fiction that we are creating in places like Mexico or all Latin America or other countries, really listen to other voices that are not quite heteronormative, the usual, the hero, etc. So I really hope that people that read other types of stories can connect with us, so to speak, because us are actually all of us. But if you go into commercial speculative fiction and the publishing world, it's more difficult to give voice to us. So it's really wonderful that this fellowship is giving voice to more of us. And in that regard, I hope that people really listen to and really can connect, because sometimes it's like, oh, if it's not the usual, little reference, people is not going to connect and it's not going to sell, which is a fallacy. I don't believe that. So I really believe also, as Vandana was saying, that really shake us and really make us think beyond our own limits in some way, and beyond our own references that are comfortable. And I also hope that the stories can make people what stories do to me, which is rethink things, which is make questions, and to try to not only, get entertained, but also to inhabit this world in a different way. To me, fiction does that. So I hope the fiction that we create also do that for other people, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Hannah?
Okay, I'm next. Yeah, so for me, it's like they've said, it's about thinking beyond what we have now. And for me, it was a challenge, I'll have to admit, because for years, especially in this part, you talk about the third world, things have been going a certain way. And somehow we kind of get used to it. And you think, oh, it's just the way it is. We have to work our lives around nothing happening, nothing much happening. It's like we're reactive. So, when you have these stories that, you have people doing things, that is shaking you out of a certain way of thinking. And that's the hope, is that things are possible, apart from, it serves as a cautionary tale on some level. Yeah. You can also balance that out with, but this is what has been happening. And when, like Joey talks about, grounded in real science. So it's not like it's all in your head. Things are happening already that you can cue into. you know, so it's giving that hope of, oh, we can join the conversation, we can make changes, actual real changes, if we can move out of this state of inertia of, oh, what's the use, and, you know, what's the point of all this? And I think that is what the stories can help us and readers do.
Thank you all so much. So we're gonna very quickly shift to the next stage. As we said, we're kind of rushing through this 90 minutes together, but I do want to relay one question from our attendees, which is from Steve. And Steve asks, how do you find a climate solution that might work around which to build a story? And again, I'll ask you to like try to answer each very quickly on this, but as a round robin. But yeah, how do you, like, where do you get your inspiration from, or where do these ideas come from, or where in the research process does that kind of like central idea, what science fiction theorists sometimes call a novum, where does that come into the process?
Are we going in the same order?
Oh, I don't know, whatever order works.
Well, let me just jump in very briefly then. You know, it's like when you're writing a story, it's really when it becomes a story for me is when there's a character and a place. And usually the way it happens is that even though I live and work in the US, I have, you know, a lot of connections with movements in India. And so what I do is I try to follow what it's like in the most vulnerable communities and try to see things as much as is possible for me from their perspectives. And because I also read a lot of academic papers, you know, so I come across the technological solutions as well. And the important thing is that the solution, so until the character comes with the setting and the community, until that point, I don't really know what the solution is, or whether I'm going to apply an existing solution or come up with another one, or expand on another one. So it's a very complex process of coming up with the idea. But it really depends on how the story germ kind of grows and what happens from there.
Anna, Libia, any thoughts to add?
Yeah, I think I'm a little bit the same. If I think that I will have a solution, I wouldn't be probably a science fiction writer. I will be a politician or something. I think it's a huge burden to just like ask writers to, oh, please come up with solutions, because we can imagine a lot of stuff and we can research a lot of also, but we are like, I don't think our job is to provide solutions. I think our job is provide lands of imagination and ask questions. We ask a lot of questions in our stories, even a question like, what could be a solution for this particular character in this particular setting? And I think that can be a little seed that like can, you know, germinate later in bigger things. But I think my short stories are more questions for solutions and searching for solutions in a collective way, more than to provide answers, because I am just one little person that doesn't have much answers even in her own life. So less alone for the whole climate crisis and disaster. But we try to make like interesting questions and stories, I think, yeah.
Okay, yeah, like in this case, for me, I started with the problem, kind of, because like I discussed with some of the people that CSI was so gracious enough to link us up with. I had this issue, it was looming large, the oil thing, where I come from. I actually wanted to write about something else in my head, but I was like, it's kind of like ignoring the thing that is staring me in the face. So I said, okay, what is the solution? And what happened for me is looking back at what's, like we talk about government. They said, oh, this is what they're going to do. After the Ogoni, so most of us might be familiar with the Ogoni, Ken Saro-Wiwa and the Ogoni land issues that happened some years back. And it's like, oh yes, the solution, they paid some money and they're going to clean up. And I'm like, okay, if they were actually doing anything, we should have heard about it in the news somehow. So my question was, are they cleaning up? what's going on? And then it leads to all these other questions, as in why and how, and if there is going to be a cleanup, how would they go about it? What would, that's where some of those solutions came in. And so I found some solutions for some of those things, which I kind of built into the story. But of course, it leads to more questions, because a cleanup is not the end of the story. You have oil spills and you want to clean it up. So what happens next? Because people have moved out of the area, you have organisms and species that are gone. So what do you do next? Are you going to get people back? How do you do it? And for us in these parts where oil is like so big, it's like if you, I was telling one of the people, like when they say, okay, maybe we should not extract the oil, that was news to me. Like, okay, no oil extraction, like ever. So what is the area going to be known for? I mean, we have to build other riches. There are other things we can deal in. It can't just be oil. It's not like without the oil, we're dead, we're useless, that kind of thoughts. So you have to open your minds for possibilities. Okay, if this is not there, what can we do? And nature is gracious. So there are a lot of things that I think, so for me, I started with the problem before I started researching solutions. And like Libia says, well, you don't have answers to everything, and I guess it's not our place to find them, but to just open ways for discussion, I think.
Yeah. Thank you all so much. And for those of you who asked questions for the fellows who didn't get them answered, I will actually, we'll see if I can steal a few minutes of their time over email and get them answered, and maybe we can find some way to either send the answers out to individuals or to the whole group for the questions that were asked. So we'll see. But thank you. And we're under like really severe time constraints. I've already let us talk for too long, but I really wanted to hear more from these folks. So what we're going to do now, if that's all right, is we're going to shift to our interactive kind of group activity, and I'll just introduce it very briefly. So thank you, Hannah, Libia, and Brenda and Vandana, sorry, Vandana, for sharing your insights and thoughts and your approach to this kind of storytelling. So now we're going to do a little bit of that storytelling. So we're going to do this in kind of a mad dash over 30 minutes in small groups, and we'll have about 15 minutes for report outs afterwards from each group, or maybe even just like 10 minutes to share results and thinking and to hear from each other and see what happened out of these small group conversations. So Adriana, I think, is going to share some links to relevant sort of Google Docs that we'll use for collaboration. But so the idea here is to build from insights, research, and policy analysis presented in the recent special issue that I talked about at the outset of the event on climate change solutions presented by JSPG and the UK Science and Innovation Network. So each small group will include one or more authors who published work in the special issue, as well as one of these Climate Imagination fellows that we just heard from, and a facilitator, me, someone from CSI, or someone from JSPG, or the UK Science and Innovation Network. So somebody will be in the room keeping time and kind of making sure that that your group is moving from step to step, because as you'll see, this is a multi-step process. So we did a bit of a survey of the special issue, and we decided on 3 really, really broad themes for the groups that hopefully cross-cut quite a bit. So one focused on issues of climate migration and displacement, one on advocacy, activism, and coalition building, and one on transforming institutions and industries as part of our global response to the climate crisis. Because it can be such a slog to move into and out of groups on Zoom, for those of you who have taught or done workshops on Zoom before, we've taken the step of we're just going to randomly assign you to groups. And that way you'll be automatically moved into a small group at the start of the session, and you'll come back together automatically. We'll all be dumped back into the same room at the end. And these are really cross-cutting themes. So we think no matter what your particular areas of interest are, you should have plenty to talk about and contribute. However, if you're like really sad and crestfallen that you're in the wrong group and the wrong theme, then you can direct message Adriana or me, and we can see about moving you. So this activity takes an approach that's inspired by science fiction prototyping, which is a popular method for building futures and sort of building stories that was initially developed coined maybe by Brian David Johnson, who was Intel Corporation's futurist for 15 years, who's a fellow at our center, and who's now the director of the threat casting laboratory at ASU. Science fiction prototyping is like used in the private sector. It's used by government agencies and nonprofits in educational settings. And it's neat And we use it a lot because it's adaptable for this broad diversity of settings. So Brian honed it in multi-day workshops with Intel engineers and business leaders, but it's also useful in classrooms and community settings. I use it in freshman level engineering classes at Arizona State University to help people explore ideas. And we can do a quick version of it here in 30 minutes, which is really important. A lot of featuring and storytelling methods are laborious and very time consuming. And this one benefits from being a multi-day or multi-hour endeavor, but you can do it very quickly. It kind of accordions in and out well. So I should say, don't worry. Nobody here is responsible for co-writing or writing an award-winning science fiction story in 30 minutes. We don't have to do that today. What we're going to do is create the skeleton of a compelling story, starting with a climate policy insight or debate based on writing and research in the special issue, and kind of incorporating insights from the contributors to that issue, and then building out a future setting, a point of view character, a window character, and a conflict in need of resolution. So it's actually the things that the fellows just talked about, that we want to build from a character who has a unique path through a setting and encounters some sort of conflict or challenge. And so we're sort of putting that character's perspective in the place in which the story unfolds at the center of the conversation. So let me just briefly introduce the early career policy scholars and thinkers who will, alongside the fellows, provide inspiration for each small group's conversation and story creation. So Alexandra Johnson from the University of California, Berkeley, and Kavi Chintam from Northwestern University wrote a piece called Best Practices for an Equitable Clean Energy Transition that was in the special issue. The subtitle of that piece is A Toolkit for US States, and it really focuses on an equitable transition and ensuring that people who are historically marginalized and oppressed are not excluded from this process of transformation. And they are going to be in our first group on climate migration and displacement, along with Libya. Next, in our second group, advocacy, activism, and coalition building, we'll have Clara Tibbetts from the Colorado State University, who wrote Removing Barriers and Creating Opportunities for Climate Resilient Agriculture by Optimizing Federal Crop Insurance. So this emphasizes farm and agricultural resilience by promoting soil health and crop diversification through the mechanism of crop insurance while reducing emissions. Also in that group will be Deb Morrison from the University of Washington, as well as the Climate Literacy and Energy Awareness Network, who wrote Equitable and Empowering Participatory Policy Design Strategies to Accelerate Just Climate Action. So that looks at participatory structures and sort of new approaches to policymaking that kind of emphasize democracy and participation at their heart. And they will be in that group along with Hannah. And the third group will have Vandana and I when Vandana has to leave. And in that group will be Wesley Chang and Kang Win from the University of Rochester. And they wrote Establishing Global Climate Resilience to Persistent Organic Pollutants Through the Private Sector, subtitled A Call to Reform Institutional Standards of the International Corporation. So, and this is a policy memo that focuses on reforming institutional regulations to guarantee proactive measures against persistent organic pollutants and investing in their removal. So sorry for having to fast forward through those introductions, and thank you to all of our early career policy scholars and experts for being here with us. And you will play a very important role in kind of catalyzing conversation in these groups. So we're now going to disperse you into your small groups, and we look forward to seeing what you come up with. And when you get into your group, your facilitator, who will be either me or Hannah or Jajun, will be there to facilitate, handle timekeeping, and help you work through the multi-step story generation process in a very short 30-minute period. And so we'll see what everybody comes up with, and try to say yes and don't worry about it being perfect. This should be hopefully a fun and energetic conversation that gets you to some new ideas and the kind of questions that our fellows were telling you that a good story will ask and pose. And Adriana, will you send us into groups?
All right, just before opening the room, I just want to remind you to please take good notes in the Google Docs, and for the authors, moderators, please record your room to the cloud so we can have a recording of that, and then we'll use some of that for future summary. So thank you. So I'll open the rooms now.
All right, welcome back, everyone. Thank you for engaging in that activity. And if your breakout group is anything like mine, you had a very energetic conversation. And it was a reminder that like when we do these in person, we try to have round tables, pre-COVID, round tables of 4 to 6 people, because it is very, very tricky to have something so polyvocal and to have, between 10 and 15 people create a story. But we do have a little bit of time here to share, sort of report out from each group and some reflection on ideas that were particularly interesting or perhaps themes that cross-cut between the different groups. So Adriana, would it make sense to start with the climate migration and displacement group?
Go ahead.
So that would be Kavi and Alexandra sharing. And we'll ask you to take about maybe like 1.5 minutes, 2 minutes tops to share.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, so we were doing climate migration and we really focused on what it means to move when you're forced to move, and what is home in that sense. Because if you physically move, you lose a lot of the things, especially if your family has lived somewhere for decades, you lose a lot of that physical and environmental reflection of what you call home. But when you're forced to move because of sea levels rising, for example, it's harder to know what that means in a deeper sense. So the setting generally is a descendant of migrants. So our main character's name is Nyla. She's coming to terms with finding and building her home in a place that's different from her family's ancestral home. And she's relocating from a coastal area to an inland region. The climate disaster has changed, but not quite destroyed the world yet, and communities are building in new ways and creating new ideas of home. So Nyla is a quiet, active observer of her community, and she bridges many groups. For example, she's multiracial and she interacts with many kinds of people. She's also an engineer in an environmental field, so she's strong and focused, but can be stubborn. So the main conflict here is that she's maybe been evicted from her home on the coast and forced to move inland. And so it's more of an internal conflict of her trying to decipher what home is to her, aside from where she's living. That's about as far as we got, but if we think about it a little more, it involves a lot of quiet and internal reflection for her, and understanding what even climate change, how that changes the definition of home for people.
Thank you. And thank you for being so brief. I know that's really challenging. So Deb, Clara from the Advocacy, Activism, and Coalition Building Group.
Claire, do you want to present or would you like me to?
Go for it.
All right, let's see if I can, I don't know if I can tell it so lovely as our last speaker. I'll try. So we thought about a story that would take those things that are invisible in the world and perceptible, that are visible and perceptible in the and the things that are invisible, and make them aspects of people or organisms more generally. So perhaps organisms might be able to communicate with humans, plants or animals, or humans might be able to communicate without speaking in other ways with each other, but that's a gift or a skill that you gain because you've earned it as sort of a rite of passage. And thinking around that, that there might be a conflict related to how organisms feel related to humanity, and that could be something that there is conflict as are going through that transition to a rite of passage, and that they're being helped by different people. So it's not necessarily youth rite of passage. It may be just like different groups of people have to pass through different stages of understanding to make things visible in the world for them, or to be able to hear and listen in the world the way you sort of gain knowledge and mastery in. And so the conflict question would be around the idea that as that type of power is being passed down, that maybe non-human organisms are expressing dissatisfaction with how humanity is operating in the rest of humanity is, and so to try and understand how to resolve that tension, and who has the power to gift that knowledge and communication ability. So that's part of the thought. That I think there's a lot to be developed, and it's super interesting to think with folks across rural understandings of agriculture and policy and learning policy. Thank you all.
Yeah, before I shift to and thank you for that. Before I shift to the third group, I just want to say that I love that these first two conversations, in the way you've narrated them, have really focused on like inputs into policy that are a lot about like values and priorities and like ideas of identity and belonging. Like that these are kind of like really important kind of framings and starting points for policy that aren't necessarily about like generating a policy solution, but are about like kind of creating the terrain. And I think that's really cool. And based on the conversation I had with the fellows at the outset, like a really good way to kind of leverage what fiction's good at, in this conversation. All right, so for transforming institutions and industries, our third group, we have Wesley Chang and Kang Wen. And are either of you or both of you ready to share some ideas that came out of our conversation?
As long as we're still okay with Kang and I making some choices for.
I think you should just go ahead and make some choices. Yeah, we had a big generative cloud of ideas.
Very creative group.
Can I start? Do you want to start, Kang?
Go ahead, Wes.
Sure. Since I'm already talking, as always. Yeah, we decided to build off of Kang and I's memo about POPs, persistent organic pollutants. The group chose mercury as a specific toxin or chemical that was bioaccumulating. And then they delved into this topic of fish, a tuna that was contaminated. And I believe we wanted to juxtapose two different experiences.
Self-aware tuna.
Yeah, okay, well, Jessica's experience is like a migrant worker that had moved someplace eating the tuna, and someone that's benefiting from the global economy, and they also eat the tuna. Both of them have contaminated tuna, and mercury can form methylmercury and leads to epigenetic modifications that can be passed down transgenerationally, that can lead to health deficits. So that thing is fast forward to the future of their descendants that have health issues because of this contamination. But I think they're living in a POP mercury-free world because they're in the past and institutional change had decided to do that for the best of the climate resilience. I did get lost as to where we move from there. So I think King, you might.
Well, we wanted one character to be a migrant worker, works on a fishing boat, works with the contaminated tuna, and then another character who gets contaminated, possibly a woman, because she can get pregnant and then can pass on those detrimental effects to the child. So a lot of generations of characters, and then the conflict is I think we came up with a couple scenarios. Since our group was focused on institutional changes, possibly one group that wants to kind of dismantle some of the regulations that have been in place, since a lot of these issues tend to be economically driven. Like why clean up the environment when you can manufacture things or do things on the cheap with different chemicals. I kind of forgot some of the other ones too.
I believe that that's like there's two generations that have different experiences with this epigenetic modification and leading to some sort of like systemic change to provide equitable access to whatever solution would be. But there's a lot in the chat that I cannot filter through. Sorry to everyone else.
All right, so thanks everyone. Yeah, I mean, sharing for the first two, there's another kind of like, I think, the idea of an input into policy of like a transgenerational or cross-generational responsibility and duty and embracing the way that science fiction stories let you get to the causality over a longer sweep of time, I think is a really cool idea and something I'll be thinking about coming out of our conversation. So, oh, and thank you, Libia. That's true. There is a lot of discussion about food in these stories, and I think food is going to be such an important lever for talking about climate as we go forward, because it's so visceral and inescapable. So I'm going to hand it over to Adriana with a final thank you to everyone for engaging in this activity, for doing it in such a brutally condensed way, and for coming up with such cool ideas and sharing them so succinctly. I know that's all actually very tricky and can be a little bit draining. So thank you all. It's been really, really cool to be part of. Adriana.
Hi, thank you all for joining us today. Apologies for being late in the beginning. I was in a work meeting, but just wanted to say hi. As Joey mentioned, I'm the CEO, managing publisher of the journal Science Policy and Governance. I know he already gave you an intro, but I wanted to thank our team at JSPG for helping with the event. Thank you, Joey, for moderating. As well as thank you to ASU, Center for Science and the Imagination, for partnering with us on this, as well as UK Science and Innovation Network, as well as the issue. And it's been really great hearing all of your ideas, and really great to have the authors from the issue here today, because that's why we do what we do. So it's great to hear your thoughts and ideas from your publications as well. So thanks everybody who joined us today, and enjoy the rest of your week.
Thank you, everyone.